3rd of March. Now, those of you who've been watching X or listening to X will know that I made a post this morning saying that I'd heard some very loud explosions coming from some distance away to the north of where I was situated in Partick. I didn't know what they were, and somebody said, well, I must be the only person who didn't know what was happening this morning. And as it turned out, it was, of course, some high-rise flats in Wynford Place up in Maryhill being demolished by explosive devices. So 3 huge high-rises basically blown down by controlled explosions earlier today. And that sound, you could hear that from miles away. And it was a huge series of explosions. From where I was sitting at the time, it appeared to be coming from the railway tracks to the north of Partick railway station, but then again, well, it would do because that's where the railway tracks go. They head up to Maryhill. Someone else joked online that this was actually the sound of Labour support imploding, and it might well be that Labour support has imploded. In fact, many people are saying that it already has. In fact, if you listen to Through a Scottish Prism, the podcast, you'll find that this is exactly what is being talked about at the moment. Labour support hemorrhaging in Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom as Sir Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves bring in what must be the biggest austerity package that there has been since the Tories were in power. And many people are baffled as to why the Labour Party should embark on what is essentially the exact opposite of what they promised, making Anna Sarwar look absolutely ridiculous and fumbling around trying to find ways of explaining both why the Grangemouth refinery was closing and also why his party, which had promised that there would be no austerity, was actually introducing it. All of which has gone on to basically undermine the entire premise that Labour was elected upon in Westminster. And, well, to be honest with you, I have no sympathy for anyone who voted Labour. And I'm talking as a former Labour voter myself of many years standing and a trades unionist as well. So I am just as disillusioned, if not more so than everyone else. But I learned that lesson a long time ago, back in 1997, when Tony Blair took Labour to the right of centre of politics in the first place. But what Starmer has done is lurch even further to the far right. And it's no coincidence that his support has plunged ever since. And in fact, what Paul Kavanagh-Mawson was saying in his Ginger Doug column today is actually very true. Normally, it takes an austerity government several years to lose all their support and then lose the general election. The Labour Party, or the Labour government, I should say, has managed to do that in a matter of months. Anyway, moving on from that to what the real meat and potatoes is of today's programme. Now, a couple of people have asked me, and indeed asked other people, such as Sarah Salyers, what a convention of the estates is. Now, you may have heard this mentioned in connection with Scottish independence many times in the past. So what exactly is a convention of the estates? Well, back in Scottish history, pre the Union, well before the Union, the Scottish political system was based primarily on the king. Now, the king was the only person in Scotland who could call a parliament, because it was effectively the king's parliament. And when he called a parliament, all the nobility, that's all the people related to the king or ennobled in some way, all the barons, the lords, the ladies, etc., they would form the first estate. The second estate was formed from the clergy. That would be all the senior churchmen, and it was primarily men back then. And the final third of this triumvirate would be the burghers. These would be the representatives of all the major metropolitan areas of Scotland. These would be the local burghers, I think is the way that they're described, but these would be the aldermen. These would be the senior figures of any local authority, any town or city. Now, much the same way we still have some of these structures, of course, we don't have a legitimate king anymore, because Charles never swore the accession oath and can't wear the Scottish crown. But we still do have a nobility. There are still quite a lot of lords and ladies knocking around in Scotland who probably have no right really to exist and are just a historical artefact, an anachronism which lives on to this day. And then there are the burghers. Now, in our case, the burghers in modern parlance would be local authorities, such as the one I happen to live within, which is Greater Glasgow, or Glasgow and Clyde, Glasgow City Council, whatever it's now called. But the Convention of the Estates, the history of this goes back a long way. There were long periods of time in Scottish history prior to the Union where a Scottish king could not be found or appointed. Now remember, the Scottish kings have always been chosen by the nobility. They had to be hand-picked from a group of families which had so-called royal blood. And those would be selected by the nobility and largely elected almost. And the idea was that the king would be chosen from this wide-ranging group of clans and families who had royal blood to be the most legitimate contender, if you like. Sometimes there were two, sometimes there were battles and murders and so on. But in any event, the king would eventually be chosen and would form a government, which he would call, involving all of these three parties. But there were large periods of Scottish history where no king was present. For example, King David, who spent most of his time at the English court back in the days, way back, would have been absent, would not have been able to call a Scottish parliament. And so the nobility and the clergy and the burghers of Scotland needed some other way in which they could call a parliament themselves. And that's what the Convention of the Estates actually was. It was a way in which, in the absence of any so-called legitimate Scottish government, a government could be called by the three estates. Now, obviously, we kind of lack that three estates now. In modern democracies, lords and ladies and the nobility don't actually have that power anymore, nor do the churchmen or churchwomen. So traditionally, those two parts of the three estates have largely disappeared. So who would be involved in a modern version of the Convention of the Estates, and why would we even need it? Well, the answer to that is very simple. There is no current Scottish king who is legitimate in any way, and there is no legitimate Scottish government. There is only the imposed devolved administration, which was created by the UK and signed into their law in 1998 under the Scotland Act 1998, which was a Westminster Act. Now, there was a component part signed in Scotland, also called the Scotland Act of 1998, which was signed by presumably somebody in Scotland, but I'm not really sure who that was. But anyway, what's actually happened is we have a devolved parliament over which the people of Scotland have no control. Although we elect the people to that parliament, the parliament has very limited powers. In other words, it is not a legitimate Scottish parliament, it's a parliament being imposed by England. And because of that, in the absence of a real parliament, the Scottish people themselves would have to call a Convention of the Estates. If we wanted to change our constitutional status, we would need to invoke that right. And that right is still in the law books of Scotland. It's still on the statutes. It's never been revoked, like much of the Scottish Constitution, which developed over nearly 1,000 years. It's still there and it can still be used. But in what circumstances would we have to use it? Well, the answer to that is pretty simple. If you think about the Scottish parties who are currently in positions of power in the Scottish Parliament, and I include, incidentally, those pro-independence parties such as the SNP, ALPA, and the ISP, and the Greens, but also all of the pro-union parties, the Labour Party in Scotland. Remember, it's the British Labour Party in Scotland because it's not a Scottish party. The British Conservative Party in Scotland because it's also not a Scottish party. And the Liberal Democrat Party, which is also an English party, not in any way really related to Scotland. So we have a parliament which is populated in almost equal measure, slightly more pro-independence MSPs than anti. But the basic premise is that we can't control our own constitution. We cannot make decisions about foreign policy, for example. We can't make approaches to other countries. We cannot do trade deals abroad. We can't rejoin the European Union. We can't decide on our own defence, and a myriad of other things that we cannot do because they're all allegedly reserved to Westminster. Now that means we don't have a legitimate parliament. And so if the parties of independence, such as ALBA and the SNP, do not have the wherewithal to simply stand up and repudiate the union and reject it and say we're not going to comply with any of its provisions, and we repudiate the Scotland Act of 1998 and we want it gone, there is no real way that our politicians could call a convention of the estates, not in the traditional sense, because they wouldn't have the power to do it, because the power to do that has been removed. The powers that the convention of the estates have, or had, would have been both to appoint a new king, a new monarch if we wanted one, but more importantly to appoint a new government with full powers, which obviously we do not have at the moment. And because we don't have it, that is really the trigger for using the Convention of the Estates in order for us to formulate new legislation. The question really is, would Holyrood have to be abolished first before a convention of the three estates, or the existing estates of Scotland, could be called? And that's not absolutely made clear. However, what is clear is that once Scotland has the full right to self-determination, and that has been recognised internationally, particularly by the United Nations, then the brakes are off. And the people of Scotland could appoint a People's Parliament like this, a Convention of the Estates, in modern form, in order to enact legislation which would allow a full referendum on leaving the Union. Now, remember that the last referendum that we all were forced to live through was a British construct. Even the Edinburgh Agreement was something which was engineered and negotiated by the UK government, possibly against some of the wishes of Alex Salmond, who was forced to negotiate with them some form of democracy in which the people of Scotland would hold the full powers to remove Scotland from the Union for one day. But also, we also know that because the previous referendum, being constructed by the United Kingdom, run by them according to their rules, dominated completely by them and their media, because Scotland had no free media, there was no way it was ever going to be possible to win it, simply because the UK had too much power over it, and they broke the rules which they themselves set. I'm referring specifically to the rule of purdah. The rule of purdah means that no party in a binary referendum may change their offer, their proposal, their idea, their policies, their legislation. They are not allowed to come out with a new decision like that, a new offer to the electorate within the last, I think it was the last week prior to the actual referendum taking place. It might have been 10 days actually, I'll check the purdah time. But either way, we all know that the UK came out with the vow. Now the vow, the way they got around the fact that they broke purdah was that they gave the vow, or the task of providing it, to their tame media. The Daily Record primarily produced the vow. And then they got all the three leaders of the three UK parties to agree to it, and the vow was that Scotland would not be able to use UK currency, would not have access to the Bank of England as a bank of last resort, which was then conflated with the idea that Scots wouldn't be able to use British money, which of course was a lie. All of these things taken together meant that that referendum was unwinnable, because every time we got close to having 50% or more of the Scottish electorate wanting independence, they could simply move the goalposts further away, or in fact just change the game altogether, change the rules under which it was operating. Having a Convention of the Estates legislate in absence of a real Scottish Parliament, a legitimate one, would allow us to hold a referendum under our own rules in Scotland only, and ban the use of UK media in the promotion of either side. Having done that, we could also control the franchise. Now, the franchise is the people who are allowed to vote in any referendum or in any election. And the franchise, which was decided upon in 2014, included anybody living in Scotland for any length of time. And that included students who were here just temporarily. It included English people who owned second homes. And it included recent arrivals who'd lived in Scotland for weeks or months, never mind years. And by doing that, that also gerrymandered the vote numbers and reduced the chances of independence being the dominant opinion in the Scottish polity. So all of these things, we all know that that happened. We also know that there were a lot of voting irregularities. There were millions or thousands of yes votes found stuffed into waste paper bags and left on the streets and in other places and in vans and so on. And a lot of the voting statistics came back with ridiculously unrealistic returns, saying that 98% of people in such a place voted and 70% of those voted no. All of these things happened. We couldn't do anything to change that. Neither could Alex Salmond or anybody else. That was because the United Kingdom made the rules and broke the rules when they felt like it and changed the offer that they made the population within the stated purdah period, which they shouldn't have done and which should have resulted in the entire referendum being rerun on the basis only of what had already been decided, but that never happened. And then all the votes, instantaneously the day after the referendum took place, the votes were destroyed before anybody could actually count them. Again, very coincidental and handy for the United Kingdom. Now, while we're all being distracted by news about Nicola Sturgeon, Colin Beattie, and Nicola Sturgeon's estranged husband, Peter Murrell, and the 2-year, £2.3 million police investigation into a sum of money which was almost a third of the amount of money spent trying to figure out where it went, we've been distracted from what the reality is of living in Scotland and what we actually need to do. So far from arguing amongst ourselves whether Nicola Sturgeon was complicit in it, whether she's a CIA operative, British spook, or whether she had just been bullied or threatened into throwing the referendum out the window and referring it to the Supreme Court, doesn't actually matter. And in fact, in some ways, when you think about it, Nicola Sturgeon referring the whole issue of holding a referendum to the UK Supreme Court was a way of drawing a line under it and saying that it isn't possible for the Scottish Parliament to ever hold a referendum on leaving the Union unless the colonising power, that is the UK, agrees to it. And so it isn't possible for a Scottish Parliament to make that choice, to make that legislation. And so the only democratic way that the Scots could do this would be to hold a modern version of the Convention of the Estates. Now, I know other people have argued that the Scottish Parliament should simply repudiate the Union when we have a majority of pro-independence MSPs and then legislate anyway. And actually, that is what was meant to happen. That is what Mike Russell said should happen. That when we were dragged out of the European Union, which of course we were, that would trigger a referendum, and it would be legislated for by the Scottish Parliament in defiance of the UK. And then they would challenge the UK to prove, legally that it was unlawful to do so. But what actually happened was they did it the other way around. Nicola Sturgeon went to the UK Supreme Court, had it challenged in court before it ever happened, and then, of course, it wasn't possible. But although it looked at the time as though Nicola had sabotaged the entire process of trying to gain independence using Holyrood as the means, what she's actually done is basically said it can't be done with Holyrood. It must come from the people. In fact, she's actually said that several times in the past, that if the people of Scotland want independence, it's up to the people to make sure it happens. That is actually the truth, because every other doctrine, including what was known as the Thatcher Doctrine, which stated, and this is what Mrs. Thatcher wrote also in her memoirs, that if the Scots wanted independence, they merely had to elect a majority of Scottish MPs who were pro-independence to Westminster. And that happened. That happened in 2015 when we had 56 out of 59 seats for pro-independence MPs, and yet no independence occurred. And then again, nobody actually demanded that it should either. But now we know that there is no way, while we take our orders from the UK and when we have to ask permission to hold a referendum, that we can ever hold a referendum at all if we go along with the Scotland Act of 1998 and we accept that the Parliament in Edinburgh is legitimate. I contend that it's not a legitimate Parliament. It is a colonial administration with the name of the Scottish Parliament pasted onto it, and this fancy, over-expensive, over-elaborate building constructed in Edinburgh, which was 10 times the original price, incidentally, like so many other British infrastructure projects. But the point is that there isn't another way of doing it, and a constitutional referendum on leaving the Union has to happen from outside of the Union, outside of its control, and using a Convention of the Estates, which is backed by a United Nations ruling telling us that Scotland's people have the right to self-determination. At that point, the Scottish Constitution provides us with a way of forming a government and a parliament which is capable of legislating for independence referendum. It's the only possible way of doing it. And even many legal experts now agree that this is the only potential way of doing this. Sorry, I'm just peering at the viewer numbers. There are 51 of you watching this right now. Thank you very much. So, to sum all of this up, despite what's happening around us, despite the collapse of Labour support in Scotland, and despite the fact that we're distracted by stories of, pardon me, Nicola Sturgeon, Colin Beattie, and Peter Murrow, all being mired in this more than 2 years of Police Scotland investigations, which have proved virtually nothing. And so far, the only person left wondering what's going to happen to him, I suppose, is Mr. Murrow, who we still don't know whether he will face charges or not, but obviously the investigative magnifying glass has not been taken off him yet, and so we wait to see what will happen. But as Paul Kavanagh-Mawson pointed out in his Wee Ginger Doug blog, it will probably happen, if there is to be a court case against Mr. Murrow, it will probably happen just before the Scottish general election in 2026. Completely coincidentally, it will be nothing to do with the British government timing it that way or Police Scotland timing it that way. It will just happen to be at the same time, just when we don't really want the distraction. So rather than being distracted, let's focus on what's possible and what's actually legitimate and lawful, and that is to seek adjudication from the highest court that there is, the United Nations itself, on whether Scotland is a colony or not. And as I've mentioned several times in the last few days, Salvo's research in this area has put together a dossier of historical evidence which proves that Scotland, although it may be not characterised as a colony by the English state, was probably the first colony of the United Kingdom, and it was used as a way of experimenting on subjugating people, of removing their sense of national identity, threatening them, slaughtering those who got in the way, deporting people who sent their children to particular schools even, and denuded an entire area of the country of anybody who spoke out against the UK. All of that is clearly colonial behaviour, and I could go on and list many, many other reasons why colony status is exactly what Scotland has. But when it comes to it, it's up to the United Nations to look through these historical facts and judge whether Scotland is a colony or not. Whether it's called a colony, whether the UK has been regarded as a unitary state or not, the historical facts point in the exact opposite direction, that Scotland is still a colony, and it is still being held against its will, and its people are being denied any meaningful democracy to decide their own fate, in other words, self-determination. When you are denied democracy, enough democracy that you can vote on a major national issue like this, which involves the whole population, you're not living in a democracy. You're living in a totalitarian state, a dictatorship, in which the people have no right to self-determination. And the only body which can correct that is the United Nations and its C24 committee, which only deals with countries being decolonized. And remember, over 60 other nations, which were former British colonies or protectorates, are now free. And they, in most cases, did so by decolonizing themselves. And the United Nations was there to make sure that process happened fairly and democratically. And that is all that we need as well. So assuming that the UN sees the force of our arguments, I can't see how they could avoid it. Then the next step after that, because our politicians cannot act and our nobility no longer really exists with any meaningful power, then the people have to form a convention of the estates of their own. And that will mean a new government effectively separate from Holyrood and acting for all of the people, but not a part of the party political system and not a part of the British establishment, and seeking no permission from the UK to do it. If the UN backs Scotland's right to self-determination, there will be lots of interesting offers that will come from the UK, where they will offer an independence referendum with all sorts of strings attached, and there will be restrictions on what powers they actually can vote for, and there will be caveats about who can and can't vote. And the whole thing is going to be dragged out for years because the UK doesn't want it to happen. And if it does have to happen, the UK would rather it was in charge of it. But that can't happen. And that's the whole point of decolonisation, and that's the whole point of the C24 committee, is so that the people themselves hold a referendum, a democratic event at which they choose. And it's not interfered with by the controlling power, in other words, in this case, Westminster. So that's where we're at, and I thought it's worth explaining why the Convention of the Estates, or a modern equivalent of it, is the only way that we can legitimately exercise that right to self-determination at some point in the near future. Anyway, that's it from me today. I hope you find this program enlightening, and if you have, and if you enjoy Inde-Car on a regular basis, please donate to the crowdfunders that I have now and again. I'll post some more links to my PayPal account, and if you want to donate to Inde-Car, you can do so. Anyway, that's it from me today. I hope you have a pleasant weekend, and there are no more big explosions that are going to scare the living daylights out of people who didn't know what they were. In the meantime, keep the faith, and I'll see you again next week. Bye-bye for now.